Hello folks, and welcome to this lesson on the properties of ionic and molecular compounds. So to start, before we talk about the properties of these types of compounds, we are going to talk a little bit about how they are made. To talk about ionic compounds, we need to talk about ions first. As a reminder, atoms are capable of gaining or losing electrons to have a full or empty electron shell because it is stable. The usual pattern when it comes to gaining or losing will depend on which one is more convenient. So if an element in its natural state, in its outermost shell, its valence shell, only has a few, one or two, maybe 3 electrons, it'll tend to lose them. However, the closer it is to 8, which is sort of a magic number when it comes to these atoms, then it'll gain enough electrons to have 8 electrons in that valence shell instead. So for example, something like oxygen, which has 6 valence electrons, is going to gain 2 more to have a -2 charged ion, rather than losing 6 and having a 6+ ion instead. When it comes to the different types of elements that you have, you typically have metals and nonmetals forming ionic bonds. That's because of the fact that metals, only having a few electrons in their valence shell, are going to tend to lose electrons, which are then gained and taken up by nonmetals, which tend to gain electrons. Now, when that happens, your metals which have lost electrons are going to have a positive charge, and your nonmetals which have gained those electrons are going to have a negative charge. This is because electrons are negatively charged, so if you lose negative charges, you become more positive. If you gain negative charges, you become more negative. And so when you have that give and take of electrons happening, that's how you get that ionic bond, because you have something that's positively charged and something that's negatively charged, and between the attraction of that positively charged cation and negatively charged anion, that's how you get that attraction and that bond between those ions. And that's an ionic bond, when you have an attraction between those negative charges. Because an ionic compound is formed between the attraction between positively and negatively charged substances or ions, when you have these positively and negatively charged ions, they aren't going to pair up 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or anything like that. An attraction is going to happen with many at the same time. And so if I express this attraction with the dotted lines, you can see that anything that is oppositely charged with each other is going to become attracted. And the more you have, the more that are going to join this clump of ions. This clump of ions is not going to be just clumping in any shape or size. It has a very, very regular shape. It clumps in patterns, and those patterns are called lattices. So once again, you don't have cation ions and anions forming compounds in very, very small formations. You get these bigger clumps happening instead, and those clumps are rigid structures, regularly shaped structures as well, called lattices. Due to those rigid lattice structures and the fact that they are made of ions, the ionic compounds do have these sorts of properties. So instead of being a soft sort of solid, they will tend to be very hard, and when you break them, they won't sort of bend away from where the force is being applied. They will break, or when they break, it'll have a very, very sharp plane. Also, because they are made of ions, if you have them in solution, so dissolved in water, or if you put them into liquid state, they are going to conduct electricity. And because of those strong bonds between those ions, they also have high melting points and boiling points, and therefore you are going to find that they tend to be solid at room temperature. On the other hand, when you have molecular compounds, they use covalent bonds. So the bond type is called covalent, whereas the compound, what you make out of it, that is called a molecular compound. Covalent bonds are usually formed between nonmetals and nonmetals, and if you want to know the reason why, take grade 11 chemistry. And this bond isn't formed by the giving and taking of electrons. This bond is formed by sharing electrons. So electrons and valence electrons are still involved in bonding, but instead of give and take, electrons are being shared. Because of the fact that you don't have a particle that is just attracted to every other particle that is oppositely charged to it, molecular compounds are going to create distinct molecules. So for example, if you have a hydrogen and a hydrogen sharing electrons with each other, if there is another hydrogen, it doesn't have the capacity to be able to share the electrons with this other hydrogen. So this hydrogen is going to form a covalent bond with a different hydrogen, and these hydrogens are all going to be very, very distinct. So because of this, molecular compounds are going to have these sorts of properties. So instead of always being hard and shattering when force is applied on them, they might bend and they might spread out a little bit more, and they will be a little bit more malleable than ionic compounds. Also, because of the fact that you don't have charged particles, you don't have ions involved, they are not going to be good at conducting electricity in any form. And also because of the fact that this sharing and the molecules can look very, very differently from different compounds, between different compounds, you're going to have a very large range of melting points and boiling points. So you might see some things that are liquid at room temperature, some are going to be gases, and others are going to be solids. As a last bit, pause the video and see if you can figure out which of these combinations are going to end up forming ionic compounds and which ones are going to form molecular compounds. Here are your answers here. If you have any questions about any of this or any of the other things that I've talked about, make sure that you do come and ask me questions. Otherwise, that's the end of this lesson. I'll see you next time.